and welcome to the DVB Newsroom. I'm Nora. Joining me in studio today is Jason Tower, the Country Director for the Burma program at the United States Institute of Peace. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me on.
Yeah. You've been documenting the spread of what has been called cyber scams in Myanmar. Can you explain what a cyber scam is and how it has evolved in the country?
Yeah, so the history of this particular form of online scamming, this particular form of cyber scams, it actually evolved out of the illicit offshore Chinese gambling, online gambling operations, which go back to really the Philippines and northern Myanmar, back to the early 2000s. As online gambling became a feasible technology, you saw where a lot of Chinese illicit criminal syndicates got involved in, first in mainland China, really trying to see whether Chinese law enforcement would crack down on that or not. You had quite a lot of crackdowns that happened in the early 2000s as some of this came up online. Keeping in mind that all forms of gambling are illegal in China. And these online gambling syndicates then spread across Southeast Asia. They built initial hubs in the Philippines and in northern Myanmar. Later on, they pivoted into Cambodia. But by around 2017, 2018, you saw where online gambling in China had become in the range of a $40 to $80 billion illicit industry, and that these online gambling syndicates had really started to build out huge amounts of infrastructure to house their highly labor-intensive operations. It's around 2016, late 2016, early 2017, that these online gambling syndicates first moved into the Myanmar-Thai borderlands. But I think the key thing that happened was you saw that by around that time, there were already in the range of 500,000 or so Chinese who had left China and gotten involved in online gambling networks across Southeast Asia. And they saw where one of the challenges that they faced was you started to have a lot of competition to get access to the China market, to get access to customers. And so they started using some very shady tactics to target people in China. They would go on to social media platforms, and they would try to use different forms of enticements to get people addicted to gambling. Sometimes they might use a romance scam, trying to befriend someone, build what appeared to be a romantic relationship with someone before getting them to start gambling or setting up accounts on a particular platform. Or in other cases, they would use other enticements. And it was around late 2017, early 2018 that we started hearing about the first instances of these pig butchering scams. Basically, what happened was the same sort of approach that was used to get people to begin online gambling was instead used to introduce a form of cryptocurrency or investment fraud. So someone, after they were approached by the perpetrator, would be given a link to an investment platform, and they would be shown how to make an investment into cryptocurrency. Unlike the online gambling, which is a very risky behavior, a lot of people were averse to that. The investment platforms, it looked like a lot of the people who were putting money into them were actually getting good returns on their investments. And so it seemed from the vantage point of a lot of these victims that they both had a new romantic interest as well as a lucrative money-making opportunity. The nasty thing, though, about the pig butchering scams was after the victims started putting more and more money in, they would use that psychological control that they had established over the victim really to wipe them out of all of their assets. And so you saw throughout the latter part of the 2010s that there were a lot of large amount victims in China, people who were losing, in the range of 50,000, 100,000, 200,000, very large amounts of money. And, the Chinese government, I think, had focused a lot on cracking down on online gambling. This really became an issue just before COVID-19 started to spread around the world. And it became very, very lucrative, much more lucrative than the online gambling. And both are illegal in China. If one draws more revenue than the other, you saw where a lot of those syndicates pivoted to that. So that's really where this online scamming comes from. It was built out of the quite powerful, quite vast online gambling networks that spread across Southeast Asia throughout the first 2 decades of the 2000s. And you've seen in Myanmar where there are now more and more of these criminal syndicates that are perpetrating these crimes, not only targeting China, but targeting a global population.
From what DVB has reported, most cyber scam operations were along the border of China but have spread to the Thailand border. Why do criminals set up in these areas specifically?
Yeah, so it was really around 2017 when these China origin crime groups first entered into the Karen areas on the Thai-Myanmar border. You had some presence of them before that in the Golden Triangle in Laos, and a bit of that spilled over across the border onto the Myanmar side of the Golden Triangle. But they started targeting the Karen areas in 2017 because, similar to the China border area, you had one of the Myanmar military's border guard forces in Karen. And the border guard force, because it was under the Myanmar military and because it had this special deal where the Myanmar military, as part of the conditions for it becoming a border guard force, permitted that militia group to engage in any form of illicit activity it wanted to. This seemed to be a natural partner for the online gambling syndicates. And so in late 2016, they started coming into the Karen areas. They very quickly spread because this was a massive source of new revenue that was coming in for the border guard force. It really had no qualms about displacing people off of the lands, seizing territory, handing that territory over to these criminal groups and allowing them to set up the infrastructure. Originally it was for online casinos, but as these trends pivoted, you saw where more and more it was online gambling syndicates. And really following the pandemic, you saw that the China border, the Thai border, turned into just one criminal enclave after another, where there were hundreds upon hundreds of these large-scale compounds that were rapidly constructed to house tens of thousands of individuals who are held in almost slavery-type conditions. I mean, many of them are held almost as cyber slaves inside of these compounds. But initially in 2023, China started looking at this as more and more of a threat to its own security because the volume of the losses was really starting to add up, with a lot of the syndicates on the China-Myanmar border, having built out a vast network into China where they could launder the funds, where they could target more and more victims. And so China started cracking down in late 2023 in the China-Myanmar border area, which led to something of a displacement onto the Myanmar's border with Thailand. And now you really see where there's a continued expansion, whereas a lot of this activity has now been pushed back off of the China border. There's more and more of it that is spreading. Almost every day you see new compounds breaking ground on Myanmar's border with Thailand, with increasingly these syndicates focusing not on the China market, but on a global market, now that one, the crackdowns in China on scams have really picked up pace. And then two, you see where Chinese law enforcement more or less doesn't really pay much attention to Chinese scam syndicates that are scamming non-China nationals. So to a greater and greater extent, this is becoming a global situation.
Since the 2021 military coup, there have been media reports about cyber scam operations set up in Yangon and Naypyidaw. What have you heard about this?
I mean, first of all, that it's true. There have been what you might refer to as call centers for some of these scam centers that have been identified in Yangon, that have been identified in Mandalay, as well as in Naypyidaw, as well as in other parts of Myanmar that are quite far from the borders. So recently in Shan State, for example, there have been some compounds identified in Tanyang, in Wanhai, so really spreading into the interior of the country to a greater and greater extent. I think another important facet of this is that the scam centers are generating massive amounts of revenue. It's estimated that roughly for Myanmar alone, the scam centers are bringing in 15.4 billion US dollars per year. A lot of that illicit capital is now being laundered into places like Yangon or Mandalay. It's being laundered through sometimes cryptocurrency exchanges, or alternatively through some of these very shady foreign exchange businesses. The money then often goes into restaurants or into nightclubs or into real estate. So in some senses, this online gambling, which is now present in cities like Yangon and in Mandalay as well, and the online scamming, it's also playing into the so-called Yangon bubble, where you do see, despite all of the economic hardship and chaos that the coup conditions have created elsewhere in the country, you still sort of have this artificial economy in Yangon, where there are new restaurants opening, and it's hard to explain why that's the case if you're not really thinking about it in terms of all of the illicit funds that are now flowing in because of the online scamming operations.
UN has stated that 120,000 people in Myanmar may be held or forced to execute online scams. And we've heard about foreign nationals being trafficked into the country for this work. How many countries have been affected by this criminality?
For human trafficking, according to USIP's own research, so we put out a senior study group report on this phenomenon in May of this year. At the time, we identified 66 countries whose nationals had been trafficked into the online scam centers. Subsequently, we've identified 2 more countries, so that brings the total to 68 countries who've had their nationals trafficked in. We're seeing that recently, over the past couple of months, there's a larger and larger number of victims that are coming in from Africa in particular. And so that now is, I think, becoming a pretty big situation. You're seeing where there are quite a few countries that do not even have a diplomatic presence in Myanmar or in Thailand, or which may have, very, very few diplomatic resources on the ground in the region. Their nationals are getting trafficked in. And for those individuals, it's very, very difficult for their home countries to provide them with any support, simply because they don't have those relationships or resources on the ground to provide assistance to some of these individuals. Then I guess in terms of how far-reaching the online scams are, we've identified that there are over 100 countries that have been hit by online scams, and that in particular, the United States is becoming one of the biggest targets of these online scam operations. But it's important also to point out that countries across Southeast Asia are also getting hit pretty hard as well. In Singapore and in Malaysia, this is now one of the top crimes. Online scamming has become one of the top crimes in those countries.
Are there international efforts to assist these victims?
There are, but a lot of them are ad hoc. You see where you have these different Interpol operations, for example, where Interpol coordinates across different police agencies to try to assist police agencies across the world to have a coordinated crackdown on some of the different enablers of this criminal activity. So there's been a couple of these operations that have taken place both last year as well as this year. You also see where there's other international institutions and agencies that are starting to put more attention to this. So UNODC is doing some reporting on it. You're also seeing where in the U.S. we have the annual Trafficking in Persons report. The Trafficking in Persons report has started to really focus in more and more on cyber-enabled human trafficking as well as trafficking into these scam centers. So there is, I think, a rising international awareness as well as some efforts to try to crack down. The problem, though, is that the criminal actors behind it, I mean, they're very powerful and they become deeply embedded in not only many countries in the epicenter, countries that are hosting these industrial scale scam syndicates like Myanmar, or they're present also in Laos and Cambodia, to some extent also in the Philippines and Dubai, but you're seeing in many other contexts around the world as well, these Chinese crime syndicates have very deep connections with elites that afford them protection. They've also made major investments in leading technologies, particularly in financial technologies and fintech, some of these trading platforms, and law enforcement really struggles to keep up with some of these developments. And so I think both for reasons of the embeddedness of the criminal actors, the protection that they're afforded by elites across many of these countries, as well as because of the fact that they're operating in a space in cryptocurrency where law enforcement is still well behind the curve, it makes it very easy to perpetrate these crimes at very low cost.
Sure. Why have cyber scam operations not been totally eradicated along the Myanmar-China border? What challenges exist?
Yeah, I mean, I think first and foremost, the fact that you don't really have, at the present moment, legitimate law enforcement in Myanmar is one of the biggest challenges of all. I mean, after the military coup, you saw where the Myanmar army basically it cannibalized the police. It put a lot of police into military positions, but then it also deployed the police really to crack down on anyone suspected of being involved in resistance activities. And you really are under circumstances now where there's no political will whatsoever for the Myanmar military to crack down on all this illicit activity because it's really desperate. It's desperate for currency, for capital to continue perpetrating the war. It's desperate also to ensure that some of the key perpetrators of this, so for example, the Myanmar military is highly dependent on its border guard forces, like the Karen border guard force in Karen state. If it were to, do something to crack down on this activity there, it would really be harming its own interests. It would likely cause that border guard force to declare neutrality or maybe even to cut ties with the Myanmar military. And of course, beyond that, you have massive corruption. I mean, the Myanmar military itself is an extremely corrupt entity. And, you ask the question why some people stay in their positions as senior commanders or why they would hold positions within the SAC. Well, many of them, particularly in areas adjacent to where the scamming is taking place, they're also playing a role in providing protection to the scam centers in exchange for some of these illicit payments.
Thailand has tried shutting down access to electricity and its telecommunication networks for cyber scam centers. Has it been effective in stopping them from operating?
Unfortunately, it hasn't, and you're seeing where they continue to expand. And I think there are a couple of problems on the Thailand side. First of all is that the scam centers themselves are highly militarized. Right, so if you look at the scam centers, whether they're the ones in the Karen Border Guard Force area, or now they're really going further and further south down into Chahat, down into Three Pagodas Pass. There, the DKBA is also providing a lot of security to these compounds. On the Thai side of the border, it's very loosely guarded. Thai border guards are overwhelmed by the security forces that are associated with and guarding the scam compounds on the other side. these are also massive illicit business operations sitting on billions of dollars in assets. And so really, if you look at the Thai border, its security preparations are not adequate given what's on the other side of the border. So if Thailand wants to be effective in cutting off internet connectivity, in cutting off access and cutting off logistics and cutting off access to construction materials and all of these sorts of things, it's really going to have to do a new assessment of the security situation on its border and make some pretty big modifications in order to be able to deal with the massive criminal enterprises and highly secured criminal enterprises that have emerged on the other side of the border. And if this doesn't happen soon, I would really be afraid that you're going to see a further and further spread of this activity. I mean, it already cuts across a couple of border provinces, kind of all the way up from areas adjacent to Tachile up in Chiang Rai, going down into areas around Tak in Mae Sot, and then more recently you're now starting to see it spreading very much into the areas across from Kanchanaburi. So I think that this is one of the major challenges that you're seeing from Thailand's vantage point, is it really hasn't, I think, taken in security along its border seriously enough, or looked at how big of a threat that is now there on the other side of the border.
The Three Brotherhood Alliance launched Operation 1027 against the military in October 2023. Many political analysts said China gave its tacit approval to shut down cyber scams targeting Chinese. Is this true?
In my view, yes, because you saw starting from May of 2023 that China was signaling to the Myanmar military that it wanted the Myanmar military to do something about this problem. And the Myanmar military just simply refused to take China seriously. It largely ignored these requests, and in many cases you saw where some of the SAC's ministers even went on public television saying that this is not a problem, that China should send tourists and not police and not worry about this issue. And so I think that the Three Brotherhood and the Myanmar National Democratic Alliance Army in particular were very strategic. They saw that China had an immediate security need. Of course, the MMDAA had a real political ambition to recapture its traditional territory in Kokong and win the battle to go home. And these things sort of aligned. So you did see, as Operation 1027 kicked off, that China did some things that I think really sent a strong signal that it was supportive of the operation. It issued arrest warrants for the elite members of the Border Guard Force, the Kokong Border Guard Force. Those 10 elites, including Bai Suo-chung, who was the sort of founder of that Border Guard Force. They were the very individuals that the Myanmar military depended on to defend that territory. So by issuing those arrest warrants, China was sending a pretty strong signal of who it wanted to win that conflict. And I think ultimately, China became much more deeply engaged after Kokong fell in trying to put in place some form of a new ceasefire that almost more or less locked in the Kokong control over that particular territory. So, I think if you kind of look overall at the outcome of Operation 1027 Part 1, that it did more really than any other effort in Myanmar to eradicate scam centers. You did see where some of the high-level kingpins, including the individual I just mentioned, Bai Suo-chung, were handed over to law enforcement, and you saw where hundreds of these syndicates were pushed out, and you saw where tens of thousands, I think as many as over 40,000 people went flowing out of these scam centers back into China. So that was a pretty bold move, and I think it's been one of the most significant aspects of the crackdown that you've seen on this criminal activity in Myanmar.
You've mentioned to BBC that China is seeking negative peace in Myanmar. Could you explain what you mean by this?
Yeah, I think what happened following Operation 1027 is that China started to see that the Myanmar military was becoming weaker and weaker. And You also saw where many individuals, including those linked to the Yunnan provincial government, those linked to Chinese enterprises, started calling for China to shift gears, to shift away from cracking down on crime, and to shift towards helping to stabilize the regime so that it would be able to move forward with its economic cooperation, which at the government-to-government level, from the Chinese vantage point, that cooperation is with the SAC, it's with the Myanmar military. And so there was a pretty big push, I think, from January onward to get the Three Brotherhood Alliance and the Myanmar military to basically engage in ceasefire capitalism. That's what China was looking for. I mean, after it used coercive diplomacy to bring Operation 1027 Part 1 to a close and to get the two parties to stop fighting, to stop the Myanmar military's airstrikes and to stop the offensive by the Three Brotherhood in northern Shan, it was pushing those parties to have agreements around trade and around cooperation on Chinese investments. And I think what you saw was that the resistance was looking at how the Myanmar military was behaving, forced conscription, rebuilding its forces and troops, and it saw where this was very hostile, and it also saw where it simply didn't have security. So it didn't feel comfortable with those agreements, and hence you saw Operation 1027 Part 2. And I think now China is becoming extremely aggressive, and it's putting lots of pressure on the ethnic armed organizations using all sorts of leverage that it has, closing borders, cutting off access to basic foods, internet, water, electricity. It's using this to try to get these parties to finally hammer out some form of an agreement with the Myanmar military. But, I say that this is really negative peace because what China is angling for here is basically just to have minimal stability so that it can move forward with its economic projects that ultimately seek to give it, consolidated access to the Indian Ocean and which seek to enhance that connectivity to the Indian Ocean. That's what China is looking for. It's not really interested very much in what is in a national interest in Myanmar, nor does it have any interest at all in democracy in Myanmar.
So you have stated that Beijing aims for a ceasefire capitalism in Myanmar. How could this be done? What might be the effects of ceasefire capitalism on local communities in Myanmar?
Well, that's the thing. I don't really see where this thus far is working. So, I mean, you've seen where through a lot of these bullying tactics and pressure that some of the ethnic armed organizations are putting out these statements saying that they're ready for negotiations, right? So the MMDA and TNLA have both put out these statements, but there's zero indication that either of these parties is going to be willing to hand territories back to the Myanmar military. So it's very hard to see how any form of agreement comes out there. And meanwhile, in other parts of the country, I mean, again, you're dealing with a very weak, a very illegitimate military. And so in Kachin, for example, the KIA continues to move forward with further offensives. It's recently brought billions of dollars of natural resources, including the vast majority of the mines that supply rare earths to China under its control. And then similarly in Rakhine State, you're seeing where resistance forces are continuing forward with more and more progress on the battlefield. So there's no indication that this strategy is going to be successful, but it does seem that China's trying to flex its muscles more and more to try to get parties to come to such types of terms.
How can people interested in the issue of cyber scams follow your work in USIP?
Yeah, so you can find a lot of our reports at www.usip.org. We have several dozen reports on these issues in Myanmar. We've put out recently this senior study group report on transnational crime and security in Southeast Asia, which looks not only at the crisis in Myanmar, but more broadly at what's happening in terms of some of the trends and patterns around forced criminality, around online scamming, and the extent to which this is really global in nature. So you can find a lot of our work and reports there online on our website.
Okay, so before we conclude, what message do you want to convey about these ever-evolving cyber threats?
I think it's just important to recognize that this is a very new phenomenon that has spread remarkably quickly. And you started getting reports about trafficking victims from different parts of Southeast Asia in 2022. By 2023, you're getting reports about people really from all over the globe. Similarly, 2022 is when you started getting more and more reports about victims, some of the first victims in the US, in the UK, Canada, other places. Now you're seeing massive numbers of new victims every week. And so I think the rapid pace at which this is spreading really should be a cause for concern. This is a major crisis. You're talking about billions. I mean, we estimate that the criminal syndicates that are behind these activities in Southeast Asia are stealing in the range of $64 billion US per year. That was as of around 6 months ago now. Those numbers, from every indication, are continuing to increase. So this is really something that needs to be treated as a global security crisis. You should be seeing countries really come together to try to, first of all, defend their own national interests, to make sure that their citizens are not being scammed in this way. This is a huge transfer of wealth to bad actors. But then I think secondly, also, you need to see much more robust cooperation across countries to crack down both on all of the different enabling factors, the use of social media, the use of technology, the use of banking systems and cryptocurrencies, but then especially the very nasty elements of this, the trafficking, the modern slavery, the torture that is used by these syndicates to get people to engage in this form of online scamming. This needs to be taken much, much more seriously. We don't have anything close to, I think, a coordinated global response on this issue yet.
Okay. Thank you for joining me today in our newsroom.
Thanks for having me.